if you look at what's happened economically with shales, there have been 2 rounds of significant, and I mean significant, write-downs in shale companies, shale assets, I should say, since 2009. And that's what we call impairment charges. I'll give you a great example here. BHP Billiton, large multinational, went in and bought all of Chesapeake's Fayetteville assets, Fayetteville shale assets. And within 18 months, they also went in and bought some Haynesville assets. Within 18 months, they had to write off their initial investment in shale assets by over 50%. And you just now recently, within the last month or 2, saw significant write-downs at ExxonMobil and Royal Dutch Shell, both on shale assets. Had a pretty considerable impact on their earnings for the first or second quarter of 2013. So you're seeing these companies, they've gotten burned off shale assets. They're taking financial hits. And so where do you go from here? Well, you go to other countries because it's starting to unravel in the U.S. So you go to Mexico and you do the same, you play the same game, or you go to Ireland, or you go to France, Poland. Shale wells just aren't that great. They just have not performed up to expectations. Will you get some oil and gas out of them in the early days? Sure you will. Will it last any meaningful period of time? It hasn't in any shale play to date. But if you can keep this game going as long as possible, and now you've got the rest of the globe, to kind of do it in, you can probably keep it going for a few more years. If you notice, there's a pattern in shales. It started in the Barnett, then they moved to the Fayetteville, then the Haynesville, then the Marcellus, then the Utica, the Bakken, the Eagle Ford. And every shale play is touted by industry as bigger and better than the last. We thought the Barnett was great, but oh my gosh, now we've discovered the Fayetteville, and it just goes on. And that's exactly what they've done now. We thought the U.S. was great, but now, oh my gosh, Mexico's going to be just unbelievable. Ireland's going to be unbelievable. Poland is going to save Europe. And it's really more of a public relations exercise than anything else, because there's nothing within the actual production of shale wells that justifies the hyperbole that you hear from industry regarding shale wells. The EIA is the forecasting arm of the Department of Energy, and I have a lot of respect for the people at EIA. They're trying to do their job as best they can. But if you look at where a lot of their information comes from, it actually comes from industry. And industry, it's in their best interest to provide the most promising, what we say in the U.S., the rosiest picture that you can provide. And if you go back and you look, unfortunately, at EIA's forecasting record, it's dismal. They do a retrospective study of their own forecasting that comes out once a year. Did we get the price of crude oil correctly? No. 70-something% of the time they get it incorrectly. Did we get the price of natural gas right? No. It's like 68% of the time we've gotten it wrong. These are very high numbers. Their forecasting ability is not that great. Another thing, if I could extrapolate on that, when you hear these numbers that come out from industry, like on jobs, we're going to create this number of jobs, all of that is based on economic forecasting models. And those models are only as good as the input. And unfortunately, every student, Economics 101 student, knows that you can basically go in and reverse engineer any economic model to make it come out and have the conclusion that you want it to have at the end of the day. So whenever I hear these glowing jobs numbers and glowing economic numbers coming out of industry, whether they be for the US or Mexico or Poland or anything, I always take that with a grain of salt, because I think, you know what, this is coming from an industry that stands to gain monetarily if they can convince everybody that these numbers are going to be correct, and they almost certainly will not be correct. The best way, I think, to look at that is the reason that they make those statements is because of the crude coming out of the Bakken and the Eagle Ford shale formations primarily. And they state that, we're going to have so much crude that we won't need to look to Mexico or Canada for oil or gas. Yes. So Let's look at that. Let's look at the actual production, not projections, but what's actually happening. In the Bakken, we now know, based on actual production from the wells, that the per well production actually peaked in the Bakken in June of 2010. That was 3 years ago. There's been a frenzy of drilling since then. They've more than doubled the number of wells. It goes back to that same paradigm I stated before. They've more than doubled the number of wells since then, but the per well production hasn't gone up. And in fact, you're seeing the same thing in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford. So we knew by looking at that it was just a matter of time. You can keep up this frenzy of drilling, but those wells deplete so quickly that at some point it all catches up with you. The older wells are declining so fast that no matter how many new wells you bring online, you just can't keep that production plateau stable. And so we knew, looking at that per well production figure, that it was just a matter of time before it caught up with them, and now it has. So it's interesting. We're going to need Mexican oil.